there are many myths about Jesus. In these programs, we're talking to some experts who can help us get at the facts behind the myths. Skeptical scholars used to believe that the Bible's accounts of Jesus were written long after he lived, maybe in the 2nd century, by people who didn't know about the real Jesus. Professor Dan Wallace is one of the world's leading experts on the handwritten copies of the Bible's accounts. Here, he explains how the discovery of the earliest copy of one of these accounts overturned the ideas of scholars and showed that the accounts had been written much earlier than they thought.
Perhaps the oldest fragment is papyrus number 52, also known as John Rylands papyrus number 457, and this is housed at the John Rylands Library of Manchester University in England. It was discovered in 1934 by C.H. Roberts, who was a man recently doctored, got his PhD in papyrology and in classics. And he was rummaging around in the library of the John Rylands and discovered this fragment that is no larger than the palm of my hand, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the interesting thing about this fragment was it was written on both sides. What that told him almost immediately, it was probably a Christian fragment. The reason is, if it's written on both sides, then it would have been written on a codex, which is our modern book form, invented at the end of the 1st century AD. A codex where you bind it on one side, then you have cut pages that you flip, as opposed to the roll or the scroll that all other books at the time had been written on. And so this is written on both sides. And John 18:31 through 33 was on one side, John 18:37 and 38 on the other. 90 years earlier than when C.H. Roberts discovered this fragment, in 1844 in the journal The Tübinger Jahrbuch, F.C. Bauer of Tübingen University had argued that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than A.D. 160, and most likely was to be dated about A.D. 170. He was basing this on philosophical constructs that he had learned from his professor of philosophy, Hegel, who had come up with Hegelian dialectic, which we may know as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so through a convoluted philosophical construct, Bauer argued John's Gospel can't be dated any earlier than 160 and probably 170. And through that approach of bringing Hegelian dialectic into New Testament studies, what happened was European scholar after European scholar for the next 90 years started to late date the Gospel of John. Obviously, if it's in the second half of the 2nd century, then it has no eyewitness credibility to it, and so its historical reliability was completely dashed. But then when Roberts discovers this small fragment, he gets it published in 1935 after he had sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one of them wrote back to him and said, this manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150 and should be dated closer to AD 100. A fourth demurred. He said, no, I think this should be dated in the 90s of the 1st century. So you have these scholars who are saying the copy of John's Gospel can't be dated later than 150. It's probably closer to 100. Typically, we date that at about 125 now, but really it's a date between 100 and 150. But here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not written before the original of the document. This sent 2 tons of European scholarship to the flames and brought John's Gospel back into the 1st century. And with that and the Dead Sea Scrolls and some other things that have occurred in the last few decades, now we're beginning to see that John's Gospel has historical credibility.
The myth is that the Bible's accounts of Jesus were written long after he lived, by people who didn't know much about the real Jesus. The fact is that the accounts were written very early, within living memory of Jesus. Next time, we'll look at the evidence that these accounts are based on the testimony of people who knew the places where Jesus lived.